Alright guys, it's time to look at the late August weather pattern, and to do that we'll be looking at the EPS model, which is an average of all of the 51 ensemble members. And so we'll be looking at the 500 millibar heights to start off with, and it shows you where you have upper level ridges and troughs. The ridges are in the orange and red, and the troughs are in the bluish color. And each one of these lines, it's called an isohypsy, or a line of equal geopotential height. And once you have isohypsies of 594 or even 591 or greater, that shows you where you have a strong subtropical ridge in place that produces very extreme heat during the summer. And also where you have this very deep reds, like here in Canada, that's where we have a lot of highly anomalous ridging at the moment. So starting off with today on August 14th, right now at the moment we have a large amount of anomalous ridging there across Canada, but the core of the ridge is located here across the Gulf Coast from Texas to the east, where we have a 594 isohypsy in place. That's what's causing the extreme heat in Texas at the moment. But in general, we have a lot of ridging right now across the Mississippi Valley, with some troughing here across the northeast, and even finally got some troughing there across the Intermountain West, but still very high ridging there across the desert southwest with the 594 DM isohypsy. But going out in time here with the model, as we go out to this weekend, we have another trough that digs into the Midwest and the Great Lakes region into the Northeast. This is going to bring another wave of cooler weather, like we're seeing right now, actually, from the Midwest to the Northeast. Actually, much of the East Coast would get pretty cool from this. But to the west, we have a very strong subtropical ridge that remains in place there across the southern plains and into the Four Corners region, even showing a 597 DM isohypsy. It's indicating that we could be talking still very extreme heat across the southern plains from Texas and Oklahoma to Arizona this weekend, and then even going into next week by August 20th. Notice how we have a very strong ridge in place across the west and the Great Plains, centered there from Texas to the desert southwest, where we have a 597 isohypsy forecasted. But whenever you have a ridge, you get a downstream trough to the east of that. So across much of the east next week, we have this very deep trough, bringing more below average temperatures, very seasonable to, like I said, below normal, and pretty much bringing no sign of any extreme heat there in the east going into next week. And then just continuing on to around August 25th, the model is showing the continuation of that ridge across the west and the Great Plains region, centered there across the southern plains to the desert southwest. So there basically is still a very long time before we see any cool down across Texas and into Oklahoma and New Mexico in that area. Unfortunately, as Texas has been dealing with extreme heat again, widespread triple-digit heat, and with this forecast, it looks like it could continue well into the end of August, and as we start going towards the tail end of August, by around August 25th, the model is showing that we still have a slight troughing in the east, but it starts to break down a bit, and especially as we go further out towards the tail end of August, here by August 28th, still showing the ridge out west, but that trough in the east starts to flatten out a bit, which means we could get a warm up by the end of the month across the east, bringing more seasonable to perhaps above average temperatures. It's a bit too early to see how extreme it will be, but I don't think it's going to be that extreme. Nothing like we saw in June. It could be just your typical summertime heat at the end, during the end of August, 80s, maybe some 90s here and there the further south you go. But still, at the tail end of August, the model is still showing that ridge centered over the southern plains to the Four Corners region, which means we could be talking about this extreme heat wave in Texas continuing all the way to the end of the month, which is unfortunate. as they've been dealing with that once again this year, especially in the past few weeks. That just started to develop again after a pretty comfortable first half of the summer for Texas. And then comparing this to our other two major models for the tail end of August, this is for August 28th. The GEFS is showing about the same thing as the EPS, with the core of the ridge still centered across the southern plains and a more of a slight trough into a northwest flow pattern across the Great Lakes region into the northeast. And then the Canadian model showing about the same thing, core of the ridge centered across the southern plains and more of a zonal flow from the upper Midwest to the northeast region, bringing more of a seasonable pattern there, although it'll be warmer than what is happening at the moment and into next week, with that trough digging in across the Midwest to the northeast, bringing below average temperatures. So by the time we get to the end of the month, it'll be more of a warm up with temperatures returning to more seasonable averages. And so next I want to show you the temperature anomaly forecast from the EPS model, starting off with today, showing widespread well above normal temperatures there in Canada and even here across Texas and the Gulf Coast where we have that heat in place. But notice we actually finally have some below average temperatures across the west, that's the blue color, and also portions of the Midwest going into portions of the southeast coast. But going out in time, going to this weekend, the core of that heat stays across the southern plains. Notice the Texas area still very hot, like I've been saying. And also, but we do have some below average temperatures here this weekend for around the August 18th time frame for the Great Lakes region into the northeast, and also there across the immediate west coast from Washington down to California. And then going into next week, when we have that trough across the east and the ridge across the middle of the country, we have the most anomalous warmth still here across Texas to southern California, even across the Intermountain West above normal temperatures. But notice the widespread below average temperatures from the Midwest to the Northeast and even into eastern Canada with that downstream trough. So no sign of extreme heat for the August 20th to 25th time frame for the east, and actually could get some widespread below average temperatures. Look, we even get that continues all the way to August 25th with those bluish colors across the east before they start to fade away a little bit as that trough attempts to break down perhaps by the tail end of the month. But still, by August 25th, the most anomalous warmth still across Texas and Oklahoma to the desert southwest. Still no end in sight to the heat wave there. And then continuing all the way out to the tail end of the month. Still the most anomalous warmth. You can see the darkest colors there from Texas to the desert southwest. And we get a fading of that bluish colors across the east. We tend to get more of these slightly above normal temperatures for the tail end of the month across the east, as that trough starts to break down a little bit. But still, even with this, I would not expect any extreme heat by the end of the month. Just slightly above normal temperatures across the Midwest to the Northeast. Into the Tennessee Valley would be temperatures mostly in the 80s, perhaps some low 90s still once you get to the Tennessee Valley and the Mid-Atlantic region. But in general, the core of the heat stays across the southern plains for the rest of the month. That's the idea I'm seeing with these model cycles here. And while the Great Lakes region, or should I say the Midwest to the Northeast, will be cool for the next about 10 days before we start to see a slight warm up by the tail end of the month. And so next I want to show you the precipitation amounts through at least August 28th. The EPS is showing the heaviest rains occurring across portions of the Northeast, where we could get 2 to 4 inches of rain by the end of the month. Also portions of Florida, and even here across the upper Midwest. And this rain here across the Midwest tells me that we could be talking about still a lot of thunderstorm clusters, thunderstorm chances through the end of the month. Some of these could be severe. We still got to keep an eye on that, especially when you have a dome of heat centered over Texas. You tend to get that northwest flow pattern over the Midwest, and that's how you get the severe thunderstorm clusters across the Midwest region. And with that being said, notice the lack of rain there across Texas under that dome of heat. And comparing the rain amounts with our other two models, here's the American model, the GEFS, showing the heaviest rain still across the Northeast, somewhat there in the Midwest too, it's showing, and also Florida, and also showing the lack of rain across Texas. And then the Canadian model, about the same thing, showing some heavy rain chances there across the Midwest and Northeast and Florida, and the lack of rain there in Texas. So all three models are showing about the same thing. I'm very confident in a rainy pattern for the Northeast, Florida, and thunderstorm chances for the Midwest. And I'm very confident in a very hot and dry pattern for Texas for the whole rest of the month. And so to summarize everything I just said, going out to the end of August, I expect Texas to remain very hot and dry, with widespread 100 still continuing for the next 2 weeks, unfortunately. For the rest of the West, the Intermountain West, I expect this area to still remain hot and fairly dry over the next 2 weeks, although not as extreme heat as we saw in July, but still above normal temperatures. Other than that, I should say the Pacific Northwest should remain relatively cool and rainy. Places like Portland and Seattle over the next 2 weeks, relatively cool for you guys. The Midwest region should remain seasonable in temperature and above normal precipitation amounts or rainfall amounts. I do expect thunderstorm clusters still here in the next 2 weeks. We could still get some severe thunderstorms in this area because of that, with that northwest flow over that heat, over that upper level ridge in Texas. The southeast also, I expect some, with that trough in the east that develops next week, I do expect some below average temperatures for the immediate southeast coast and also above normal precipitation, but I do expect to warm up by the end of the month. And then for the eastern Great Lakes into the northeast, I expect above normal precipitation and rainfall in this area for the end of the month, and also below average temperatures with perhaps a slight warm up by the end of the month. But still, much of the east, I do not expect any major heat over the next 2 weeks as the core of that ridge stays out to the west. But we could still get a few days here and there of above normal temperatures, especially towards the end of the month. And with that being said, that's all I have for today. I'll see you next time, guys. Have a good one.